The radio crackle came at 3:47 hours, and it shouldn't have existed. The frequency was dead, assigned to a pilot who'd been grounded 3 months prior after what the after-action report called psychological unsuitability for combat operations. Yet there it was, cutting through the static like a blade through silk, a woman's voice calm as winter morning asking for current enemy positions in grid November 7-3. The Joint Operations Center in Bagram went silent. 12 specialists froze, eyes locked on screens that showed nothing, no transponder, no identification beacon, just that voice and a radar ghost moving south toward Helmand Province, where a SEAL team was currently 40 minutes from total annihilation. The senior controller, a major with 2 Bronze Stars and chronic insomnia, reached for the response key with a trembling hand, because he recognized that voice. And if he was right, then someone had made a catastrophically beautiful mistake or committed the kind of career-ending insubordination that sometimes saved lives. Her name was Kestrel Vance, though nobody had called her that in years. They called her Songbird with varying inflections of mockery, pity, or poorly concealed contempt, depending on who was speaking and whether they'd read her file beyond the executive summary. Fighter pilot washout, they said. Too emotional for fast movers, too stubborn for transports, ended up in the A-10 program because it was the only airframe that would take someone with her particular collection of psych evaluations and incident reports. The Warthog, that ugly, beloved close air support beast, became her last chance, and she'd flown it with mechanical competence for 18 months, until the thing in Kandahar that nobody talked about directly but everyone referenced in careful, clinical language. A civilian casualty. A bad call. The kind of thing that ends careers not with a bang but with a reassignment to administrative duties and mandatory counseling sessions that smell like institutional carpet cleaner and disappointment. But 3 months of grounding hadn't dulled the edge in her voice, that particular timbre of absolute certainty that separates good pilots from legends. The SEAL team commander, call sign Havoc 6, was currently compressed into a dried riverbed with 11 of his operators, surrounded by an estimated 70 Taliban fighters who turned a routine reconnaissance mission into an orchestrated ambush. Havoc 6 was Air Force Academy, a man who'd done 3 rotations with Special Operations Command and possessed the kind of tactical mind that saw solutions in chaos. He'd called for close air support 17 minutes ago and been told the nearest Apache were 38 minutes out. Too far, too late. And that's when he heard her voice cutting through his own radio chatter, asking about smoke markers and friendly positions with the kind of specificity that suggested she was already inbound. The sky above Helmand was still dark, that peculiar pre-dawn darkness where the world exists in graduated shades of gray and distance becomes theoretical. Kestrel Vance throttled her A-10 Thunderbolt through 8,000 feet, her hands steady on controls that felt like extensions of her own nervous system. The aircraft was a monster, 35,000 pounds of titanium bathtub, wrapped around a 30mm cannon that fired depleted uranium rounds at a rate sufficient to shred armored vehicles into component atoms. It was ugly in the way that purpose-built things are ugly, all function and brutal efficiency, with engines mounted high on the fuselage to minimize heat signature and allow for operation from damaged runways. She loved it with the kind of love that requires no justification, the way some people love scars or storms or other beautiful, dangerous things. The unauthorized takeoff had been surprisingly easy. She'd walked through 3 security checkpoints with her flight suit and gear, and nobody questioned a pilot heading toward the flight line at 300 hours because that's what pilots did. They kept irregular hours and obsessive routines. The crew chief who'd prepped her aircraft had asked no questions, just run through the checklist with professional efficiency, because he'd flown with Songbird before the grounding and knew she checked her jet more thoroughly than most pilots checked their parachutes. The engine start had been loud enough to wake half the base, but by the time anyone with sufficient rank to stop her figured out what was happening, She was already wheels up and gone, a gray ghost disappearing into darker gray sky. The tactical situation was deteriorating with mathematical precision. Havoc 6's radio traffic had taken on that particular clipped cadence that meant ammunition was getting low, and options were getting fewer. The Taliban had them boxed into a kill zone roughly 80 meters square, using interlocking fields of fire from elevated positions that made movement suicidal and staying put only marginally less fatal. The SEALs had already taken 2 casualties, both stabilized but immobile, which meant extraction wasn't just about getting out but about carrying wounded through hostile fire. The insurgents knew this, were patient about it, content to wait for dawn when their numerical advantage would become absolute. Kestrel descended through 6,000 feet and began her tactical assessment with the kind of cold calculation that her psych evaluators had called emotional dissociation, and that she called doing the job. The GPS coordinates placed the SEAL position in terrain she'd studied during endless hours of mandatory administrative work, a region of dried wadis and compound clusters where the elevation changes created natural ambush sites. She pulled up the digital terrain map on her heads-up display, cross-referenced it with the infrared feed from her targeting pod, and started identifying heat signatures that were almost certainly hostile forces in covered positions. The cannon between her legs carried 1,200 rounds, each one capable of punching through concrete or disintegrating human beings with equal efficiency, and she began calculating firing solutions with the part of her brain that never questioned, never hesitated, never remembered civilian faces in Kandahar market squares. Havoc 6's voice came through again, tighter now, informing anyone listening that they were in contact from 3 sides and had maybe 15 minutes before they were completely overrun. He wasn't asking for permission or forgiveness, just statting facts with the calm of someone who'd already done the math on survival probability. Kestrel keyed her radio and spoke 3 words that would later be analyzed, debated, and eventually taught at Air Force training schools as an example of either profound competence or catastrophic arrogance. Songbird is inbound. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then Havoc 6 responded with 2 words that carried the weight of desperate hope and absolute skepticism. Authentication required. Because in the fog of war, trust is a luxury purchased with verification codes and proper procedure, and a woman's voice claiming to be a grounded pilot could just as easily be psychological warfare or communications compromise. Kestrel rattled off her authentication codes from memory, outdated by 3 months but still technically valid, and added her aircraft tail number and current weapons loadout with the efficiency of someone reciting prayer. Another pause, longer this time, and then Havoc 6 came back with a voice that had shifted registers slightly, from commander to something more human. Songbird, you're not supposed to be flying. You're going to get crucified for this. She dropped through 4,000 feet and armed her weapons systems, the targeting computer coming alive with geometric precision, reducing the landscape below to grid squares and probability zones. Copy that, Havoc. Mark your position with infrared strobe and get everyone flat in the next 30 seconds. This is going to be close. Close was an understatement. The kind of close air support she was planning required flying low enough to distinguish individual human shapes in the pre-dawn darkness, slow enough to maintain accuracy, and precise enough to drop ordnance within meters of friendly forces. It was the kind of flying that existed at the intersection of skill and insanity, where the margin for error was measured in single-digit meters, and the consequences of mistakes were permanent. The A-10 was designed for exactly this kind of work, built around the philosophy that close air support wasn't about dropping bombs from comfortable altitude, but about getting dirty, personal, and dangerous. Kestrel pushed the throttle forward and felt the Warthog respond with its characteristic growl, that deep rumble that sounded like contained rage. She dropped to 2,000 feet, then 1,000, low enough that terrain features became distinct rather than theoretical. The infrared strobes bloomed on her targeting display, 6 points of light marking the SEAL position in the riverbed below, and around them she could see the heat signatures of enemy fighters moving with coordinated purpose toward final assault positions. She selected the cannon and felt the weapon system come online with a subtle vibration through the stick. The GAU-8 Avenger was essentially a flying gun with an aircraft built around it, 7 barrels capable of firing so fast that individual shots blurred into a continuous roar. The depleted uranium rounds were designed to penetrate Soviet tank armor, which made them catastrophically effective against human targets and light fortifications. Kestrel had never particularly enjoyed this part of the job, the casual mathematics of converting human beings into target coordinates, but she'd learned to compartmentalize it the way surgeons compartmentalize cutting into living flesh, understanding it as necessary violence in service of saving lives. The first pass came at 4:12 hours, screaming out of the northern darkness at 300 knots. Kestrel lined up on the eastern ridge, where thermal imaging showed the densest concentration of heat signatures, friendlies safely to her right, hostile positions filling her targeting reticle with geometric precision. She walked the rudder pedals slightly, making micro-adjustments that translated to meters on the ground, and squeezed the trigger. The A-10 shuddered as the cannon spooled up, 7 barrels spinning into a blur, spitting 30mm rounds at 65 per second. The sound was legendary, a deep BRRRT that resonated in chest cavities and carried for miles, part mechanical thunder and part primal roar. Below, the ridgeline erupted in sequential explosions of dirt and rock as the rounds impacted, each one carrying enough kinetic energy to pulverize concrete and shred anything biological into component molecules. Havoc 6's voice came through the radio, tight with adrenaline and something approaching religious awe. Good hits, good hits. Say again, Songbird, those are good hits. Kestrel was already banking hard left, pulling 4GS through the turn, feeling the flight suit compress around her legs to keep blood from pooling away from her brain. She came around for the southern approach, where thermal imaging showed fighters repositioning, trying to adapt to the sudden reversal of tactical advantage. These weren't farmers with AK-47s. These were trained insurgents with military experience and the discipline to maneuver under fire, which made them dangerous and made her job harder. The second pass came 30 seconds later, lower and slower, dropping to 800 feet where she could physically see muzzle flashes against the pre-dawn terrain. She selected her AGM-65 Mavericks, laser-guided missiles designed for precision strikes against hardened targets. The targeting computer locked onto 2 compound buildings where thermal imaging showed multiple heat signatures and probable weapons positions. She fired both missiles in sequence, watching them streak away on brilliant exhaust trails before she pulled hard right to avoid the backblast. The explosions came 3 seconds later, twin blooms of orange fire that briefly illuminated the landscape in stark relief, revealing running figures and the geometric patterns of compound walls before darkness reasserted itself. The tactical situation was changing. The Taliban fighters had lost their concealed positions and their coordinated firing lanes, reduced from organized ambush to scattered defensive postures. But they weren't running, which meant leadership was keeping them disciplined despite casualties, and that meant more work required. Kestrel climbed back to 1,500 feet and circled, letting her targeting pod scan for new threats while Havoc 6 coordinated his team's repositioning. The SEALs were moving now, using the chaos and dust to extract toward a designated landing zone where rescue helicopters could attempt pickup once the immediate threat was neutralized. The third pass targeted a technical vehicle, a modified pickup truck with a heavy machine gun mounted in the bed, positioning itself for a clear shot at the retreating SEALs. Kestrel came in from the west, sun rising behind her now in the beginnings of dawn, and put a 3-second burst from the cannon directly through the vehicle's engine block and forward compartment. The truck simply ceased to exist as a functional object, transformed from transportation to modern art sculpture in twisted metal and scattered components. The machine gun, notably, remained intact but unmanned, pointing skyward at an angle that suggested its operators had made a sudden and permanent career change. Dawn was coming properly now, that rapid transition from darkness to light that happens in desert environments, and with it came clarity both tactical and personal. Kestrel could see the battlefield with naked eyes now, the scattered positions, the compound walls, the dried riverbed where the seals were moving in disciplined pairs toward extraction. She could also see her fuel gauge, which was informative in an unwelcome way, and her ammunition counter, which was concerning. She'd expended roughly 40% of her cannon rounds in both Mavericks, had maybe 20 minutes of combat radius fuel remaining, and the Taliban fighters were still not decisively defeated, just suppressed and disorganized. Havoc 6 called for one more pass on northern positions, where thermal imaging was showing fighters attempting to regroup. Kestrel acknowledged and set up her approach, coming in low from the east with the rising sun at her back, a tactical consideration that would make her harder to visually acquire against the glare. She found her targets, concentrated her fire with surgical precision, and departed to the sound of secondary explosions as ammunition stores cooked off in the morning heat. The battlefield was effectively neutralized now, not destroyed but rendered temporarily non-functional, and that was sufficient for the immediate tactical requirement. The extraction helicopters arrived at 4:47 hours, two Black Hawks flying nap of the earth through the dawn light, and Kestrel maintained overhead coverage while the SEALs loaded their wounded and equipment with practiced efficiency. Havoc 6 made radio contact one final time, his voice carrying gratitude and something else, something like recognition. "Songbird, you saved 11 lives today. Whatever happens next, remember that." She acknowledged with professional brevity, banked toward Bagram, and began the flight back to Consequences. The base was waiting. She could see the assembled vehicles from 5 miles out, the pattern of them around her designated parking spot suggesting official reception rather than routine return. Kestrel set the A-10 down with textbook precision, the main gear kissing the runway with barely a chirp, and taxied to her spot with the engines already beginning their spool-down sequence. The crew chief who'd prepped her aircraft was there, standing at attention in a way that was simultaneously respectful and protective, and behind him were 2 MPs, a full-bird colonel she didn't recognize, and her squadron commander wearing an expression that could generously be described as complicated. She completed her post-flight checklist with deliberate care, documenting fuel state and weapons expenditure, noting the slight hydraulic leak that had developed in the port landing gear, recording everything with the precision that would either save her career or make absolutely no difference at all. When she finally climbed down from the cockpit, the morning sun was fully risen, casting long shadows across the tarmac, and the heat was beginning its daily escalation toward triple digits. The colonel approached first, his face unreadable in that particular way senior officers have perfected, where every emotion is filtered through decades of command experience and political calculation. "Captain Vance," he began, using her rank with emphasis, "you are hereby ordered to report to my office at 1400 hours for non-judicial punishment proceedings under Article 92 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Until that time, you are confined to quarters and relieved of all duty responsibilities. Do you understand these orders?" Kestrel saluted, acknowledged, and began the walk across the tarmac toward her barracks, aware of eyes watching from every direction, aware that she just traded her career for 11 lives, and finding herself surprisingly at peace with that mathematics. The barracks were empty at this hour, everyone else deployed or sleeping or engaged in the 1,000 routine tasks that made a forward operating base function. Kestrel sat on her bunk in full flight gear and felt the adrenaline finally beginning its recession, that familiar crash that came after combat when the body realized it was no longer required to function at crisis levels. Her hands were shaking slightly, a fine tremor that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the physiological cost of maintaining absolute control for 2 hours straight. She removed her gloves carefully, flexed her fingers, and noticed for the first time that she'd bitten her lower lip hard enough during that first gun run to draw blood. The knock came at 11:30 hours, technically before she was scheduled to report, but not unexpected. It was her squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Reeves, a former F-16 pilot who'd moved to command positions after a back injury ended his high-performance flying career. He'd always been fair with her, even after Kandahar, even when it would have been politically easier to join the chorus calling for her permanent grounding. He stood in her doorway without entering, respecting the boundary of her personal space, even in circumstances that technically gave him authority to violate it. "They're calling you the Songbird of Helmand on the intelligence channels," he said without preamble. "Combat camera caught your gun runs on thermal. The footage is—" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like official endorsement of insubordination. "Being analyzed by several very interested parties in Tampa and Washington. Havoc 6 filed a formal commendation. All 11 SEALs are alive. 2 Purple Hearts, but everyone's walking or will be soon. That's the good news." Kestrel nodded slowly. "And the bad news is I stole an aircraft, violated grounding orders, and flew an unauthorized combat mission that could have resulted in friendly fire casualties or international incident if anything had gone wrong." She said it matter-of-factly, not seeking sympathy or forgiveness, just acknowledging reality with the same cold precision she'd used calculating gun runs. Reeves allowed himself a slight smile, nothing official, just a momentary crack in his command facade. "The bad news is that you've created a political nightmare. Half the Pentagon wants to court-martial you. The other half wants to pin a medal on you. The SEALs want to adopt you. And meanwhile, I have to explain to a 2-star general why one of my grounded pilots managed to steal a $20 million aircraft and fly it into combat without anyone stopping her, which makes me look either criminally negligent or brilliantly strategic, depending on which narrative wins out." The afternoon hearing lasted 4 hours and felt like 4 years. The conference room was too small and too air-conditioned, filled with people in various uniforms representing different branches and interests. The 2-star general, a woman named Patricia Ashford who'd flown combat missions in Desert Storm and carried herself with the authority of someone who'd earned every rank increment through competence rather than politics, presided over proceedings that were technically non-judicial punishment, but felt more like trial by committee. Kestrel sat at attention and answered questions with honest precision, neither minimizing her violations nor dramatizing her justifications. The questions were predictable. Why did she take the aircraft? Because people were dying and she had the capability to stop it. Did she understand she was grounded pending psychological review? Yes. Did she believe herself to be mentally fit for combat operations despite 3 months of evaluation suggesting otherwise? She considered that one carefully before answering, because the truth was complicated. "I believe I made a sound tactical decision based on available information. Whether that decision was influenced by compromised judgment is for others to determine. I'm responsible for my actions but not qualified to psychologically evaluate myself." General Ashford studied her for a long moment, eyes sharp with the kind of intelligence that comes from decades of making decisions where wrong answers cost lives. "Captain Vance, 11 Special Operations personnel are alive because of your actions. That's indisputable. But your unauthorized flight put your life at risk, put the aircraft at risk, and violated direct orders from multiple levels of command. Help me understand something. Was this about saving those men, or was this about proving something to yourself after Kandahar?" The room went very quiet. The question was surgical, designed to cut through rationalizations and reach whatever truth Kestrel had been avoiding for 3 months. She sat with it, gave it the respect it deserved, and answered from somewhere deeper than tactical training. "After Kandahar, I didn't trust my judgment in the cockpit. Every time I'd start to climb into an aircraft, I'd see that market square and wonder if I'd make the same mistake again. The grounding was a relief because it meant I didn't have to face that question. But when I heard Havoc 6 on the radio, when I knew exactly what was happening and what was needed, there wasn't any doubt. No hesitation, just clarity. Whether that was good judgment or dangerous compartmentalization, I honestly don't know. General Ashford nodded slowly, made a note on her tablet, and the hearing continued through evidence review and testimony from the crew chief, from Havoc 6 via secure video link, from the squadron commander, from psychiatric evaluators who spoke in careful clinical language about trauma response and decision-making capacity. Kestrel listened to people describe her in third person, analyzing her actions and mental state with academic detachment, and felt oddly disconnected from the whole proceeding, as if they were discussing someone she used to know. The decision came 3 days later. Kestrel was in her quarters, reading a novel about mountain climbing and trying not to think about flying, when Lieutenant Colonel Reeves appeared with an expression she couldn't immediately interpret. He handed her a folder containing official orders on Department of Defense letterhead, and she read them twice to make sure she was understanding correctly. Not court-martial, not administrative separation. A formal reprimand that would remain in her permanent record, accompanied by reinstatement to flight status with mandatory continued psychological counseling, and a reassignment to a training role at Nellis Air Force Base. You're going to teach the next generation of Warthog pilots how to do close air support, Reeves explained. General Ashford's reasoning is that your technical skills are undeniable and your judgment under pressure, while questionable from a chain-of-command perspective, was tactically sound. She also thinks that your experience, both the Kandahar incident and the Helmand mission, gives you valuable perspective that should be shared rather than wasted. You'll never make command with that reprimand in your file, but you'll fly, and you'll matter. Kestrel looked at the orders, at the signature blocks and official seals that represented institutional decision-making at the highest levels, and felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath her professional composure. Relief, maybe, or possibility, or just the simple recognition that her story wasn't ending with Kandahar but continuing into chapters she hadn't imagined. "When do I leave?" she asked. 2 weeks. Enough time to pack out and do your transition. The SEALs want to buy you a drink before you go. Several drinks, probably. Also, someone leaked your gun camera footage to YouTube and it's got about 3 million views. People are making memes. You're famous in weird ways that will probably make your life more complicated. Reeves paused at the door, turned back with something approaching paternal pride. For what it's worth, Kestrel, I'd have done the same thing. So would most of us if we're honest. You just had the courage to actually do it, instead of living with regret. The gathering happened at a dingy bar off base that catered to military personnel, the kind of place with watered-down beer and enthusiastic patriotic decor covering water-stained walls. Havoc 6 was there with his entire team, the wounded ones sporting impressive bandages and pain medication smiles. They brought patches and challenge coins, traditional military tokens of respect, and insisted on buying rounds until Kestrel had to politely decline on grounds of professional responsibility and liver function. They told stories about the ambush, about hearing that first gun run come screaming out of the darkness, about watching Taliban positions simply cease to exist under her fire. "I thought we were dead," one of the younger SEALs admitted, a kid from Tennessee with a purple heart and 1,000-yard stare. "Thought I was going to die in a dried-up riverbed 9,000 miles from home. Then I heard this sound like God's own chainsaw and the whole world just changed. You gave us our lives back." He said it simply, without drama, and Kestrel felt the weight of that gift, the responsibility of being someone's salvation, settle into her bones in ways she'd need years to fully process. Havoc 6 pulled her aside later, away from the noise and celebration, and spoke with the directness that special operations personnel use when they've decided someone has earned unfiltered truth. You know they're going to use you, right? The Air Force, the military-industrial complex, whoever. The story's too good, the optics too perfect. Female pilot violates orders to save American heroes, all that narrative gold. Just don't let them reshape what actually happened. You made a hard call for the right reasons, and some people lived because of it. That's the story. Everything else is just noise. She flew out of Bagram 2 weeks later in the back of a C-17, surrounded by cargo pallets and other transiting personnel, the Afghanistan landscape receding below through the small window. The mountains looked different from this perspective, less threatening and more tragic, ancient geography caught up in modern conflicts that would eventually pass like all conflicts pass, leaving scars and stories but also space for whatever came next. Kestrel thought about the 11 men who would return to their families because she'd violated orders, about the people in Kandahar market who hadn't made it home because she'd followed orders, and tried to find some equation that balanced those mathematics into meaning. Nellie's Air Force Base in Nevada was different from Bagram in every possible way except the essential one. It was full of people who flew aircraft into dangerous situations and tried not to die in the process. The training squadron she was assigned to specialized in close air support tactics, preparing pilots for the exact kind of mission she'd flown in Helmand. Her reputation had preceded her, which was both helpful and limiting. Everyone knew the story, had seen the footage, had formed opinions about whether she was hero or liability, or something more complicated that existed in between. Her first briefing to new students was carefully prepared, vetted by public affairs and her command chain, designed to emphasize proper procedure and chain of command rather than dramatic violations thereof. But Kestrel found herself going off script about 20 minutes in, talking about the feeling of inadequacy after Kandahar, the 3 months of doubt, the moment of clarity when she heard Havoc 6's voice. "I'm not telling you to violate orders," she said carefully. "I'm telling you that flying close air support means living in the space between perfect information and urgent necessity. Sometimes you'll have hours to plan and clear and coordinate. Sometimes you'll have seconds. The job is to be ready for both." The students watched her with varying degrees of skepticism and interest. These were mostly young pilots, fresh from advanced training, eager and terrified, and trying desperately to project confidence they hadn't yet earned. They wanted concrete answers, clear procedures, the safety of protocol that would remove personal responsibility from impossible decisions. Kestrel remembered being that young pilot, believed she still was that young pilot in many ways, just with more scars and fewer illusions about the clarity of combat. Over months, she developed a teaching style that emphasized practical reality over textbook theory. She showed them the gun camera footage from Helmand, frame by frame, explaining sight pictures and firing solutions, and the calculated risks of flying low and slow in hostile territory. She also showed them footage from Kandahar, the Market Square approach, the moment where she'd misidentified civilian activity as hostile preparation, the explosion that still visited her dreams with regularity. "This is what happens when you're wrong," she said flatly. "People die. The right people, the wrong people, just people trying to live their lives in the middle of geography that became a battlefield. You carry that forever. But you also have to trust your judgment again anyway, because other people are depending on you to be capable, and self-doubt can be just as fatal as overconfidence." The students responded to this honesty with something between relief and discomfort. Most training emphasized success, competence, the accumulation of skills toward mastery. Kestrel taught them failure, doubt, and the necessity of continuing anyway. She made them practice gun runs until their hands cramped and their eyes burned, emphasized the difference between adequate and excellent, and pushed them past comfortable proficiency into the territory where excellence lives alongside exhaustion. Some resented her for it. Others understood that she was preparing them for reality rather than exercises, and those students became her most dedicated pupils. 6 months into her assignment, a young pilot named Alexis Cruz approached after a particularly grueling training session. Cruz was from California, second-generation military, carrying family expectations and personal ambition in equal measure. She'd performed adequately but not exceptionally, always technically correct, but lacking the intuitive edge that separates competent pilots from legendary ones. "Captain Vance," she began formally, then shifted to something more personal. "How do you know when to trust yourself again? After you make a mistake that costs lives, how do you climb back into the cockpit without second-guessing everything?" Kestrel considered the question, recognized it as the one she'd been asking herself for over a year, and gave the only answer she'd found that approached truth. "You don't stop second-guessing everything. That's actually healthy. That's what keeps you careful. What you do is separate useful doubt from paralytic doubt. Useful doubt makes you double-check your target identification and verify your firing solution one more time. Paralytic doubt makes you hesitate when people need you to act. The trick is learning the difference, and honestly, I'm still figuring that out myself. But I can tell you this. If you wait until you feel completely confident before you act, people will die while you're waiting. So you learn to act despite the doubt, carrying it with you like extra weight, but not letting it stop you from doing what needs doing." Cruz nodded slowly, processing this, and Kestrel saw in her expression the same struggle she'd lived through, the same question that probably haunted every combat pilot who'd survived their mistakes. They talked for another hour, past official duty hours, sitting in the briefing room while the desert sun set outside in spectacular reds and purples. Kestrel shared stories she'd never told the official investigators, small moments of doubt and fear that had occurred between the dramatic action everyone focused on. Cruz shared her own fears about upcoming deployment, about being tested in real combat, and discovering she wasn't actually capable of the violence and precision the job required. The deployment notification came in spring, 13 months after Helmand. Cruz and 3 other students from Kestrel's training cohort were being sent to Syria as part of ongoing operations against ISIS remnants. The farewell briefing was professionally conducted, full of standard warnings and procedures, and the careful optimism that military leadership uses to send young people toward danger. Kestrel watched her students receive their orders and saw herself at their age, eager and frightened, and convinced of her own capability in that particular way that comes before reality proves otherwise. She pulled Cruz aside afterward, away from the other students and supervising officers, and gave her a small metal object worn smooth with handling. It was the trigger grip from her first A-10, salvaged when the aircraft had been decommissioned, carrying the tactile memory of thousands of hours and dozens of missions. "Bring this back," Kestrel said simply. "Consider it loaned, not given. It's survived worse than whatever you're flying into, and so will you." Cruz accepted it with something like reverence, understanding the symbolism even if she couldn't yet comprehend the full weight of experience it represented. The months that followed were routine in the way military life is routine, punctuated by occasional news from deployed students and the steady accumulation of training cycles with new cohorts. Kestrel continued teaching, refining her methods, and learning that instruction was its own form of flying, requiring different skills but similar precision. She found unexpected satisfaction in seeing students grasp concepts, watching their confidence grow from shaky beginnings toward genuine competence. Some would become average pilots. A few would become exceptional. All would carry her influence into their own careers, for better or worse, and that legacy felt simultaneously heavy and meaningful. The call came at 2:30 hours on a Tuesday, the particular time that means bad news regardless of context. It was her squadron commander, voice carefully neutral in that way that signals emotional control over difficult information. Alexis Cruz's A-10 had taken ground fire during a close air support mission near Deir ez-Zor. She'd completed her attack run, suppressed the hostile fire, and successfully egressed the target area before hydraulic failure and fire forced ejection. She was recovered alive by coalition forces, injured but stable, and was currently en route to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany for treatment. Kestrel listened to this information with professional composure while her internal landscape underwent seismic shifts. Relief that Cruz was alive, pride that she'd completed her mission before ejecting, familiar fear about what injuries meant, what recovery looked like, what psychological scars would accumulate alongside physical ones. She asked appropriate questions about injury severity and timeline for recovery, received appropriately vague answers that meant medical personnel were still assessing, and ended the call with formal acknowledgement that concealed the messy emotional reality beneath. She couldn't sleep after that, so she went to the flight line at 400 hours and sat in one of the training A-10s, not flying, just sitting in the cockpit, and remembering what it felt like to be 26 and invincible, and certain that skill and preparation were sufficient armor against consequence. The instruments glowed softly in the darkness, familiar constellations of switches and gauges that represented years of study and practice. She touched the stick gently, felt the control surfaces respond to slight pressure even with hydraulics inactive, and thought about all the pilots past and future who'd sat in similar cockpits facing similar fears. Cruz returned 3 months later with a medical discharge, injuries sufficient to end her flying career, but not her life. The reunion was awkward in the way these things are, neither woman quite knowing how to bridge the gap between instructor and student now that professional hierarchies had dissolved into shared experience of violence and survival. They had coffee at a civilian cafe off base, away from military protocol, and Cruz returned the trigger grip with a formal little ceremony that made them both laugh at its solemnity. "I didn't lose it," she said unnecessarily, and Kestrel accepted it back with gratitude for its return and sadness for what its journey represented. "What will you do now?" Kestrel asked, genuinely curious about how life continued after the defining structure of military service ended. Cruz shrugged, a gesture that incorporated uncertainty and possibility in equal measure. "Maybe teach high school physics. Maybe become a commercial pilot if I can pass the medical review. Maybe just disappear into Montana and raise horses and try to forget that I used to drop bombs on people for a living. Haven't decided yet. But I wanted to tell you something before I left. That moment when I was hanging under the parachute, watching my aircraft burn on the ground below, I wasn't scared. Not of dying, anyway. I was scared of disappointing you, of being another student who couldn't hack it, of proving that all your teaching wasn't enough to keep me safe. And then I realized that was stupid, that you'd prepared me as well as anyone could be prepared, and the rest was just chaos and probability. So I wanted to say thank you, not just for the training but for being honest about the cost. A lot of instructors teach us how to fight. You taught us how to survive fighting, which is different." They finished their coffee in companionable silence, two women who'd chosen violence as profession and lived long enough to develop complicated feelings about that choice. When they parted, Kestrel felt something shift in her understanding of her own role. She wasn't just teaching pilots to fly aircraft. She was teaching them to carry the weight of what flying meant, the responsibility and cost and occasional transcendent purpose of being someone who could rain death from above or provide salvation depending on context and decision-making. That was a different kind of teaching, required a different kind of courage, and she was still learning how to do it well. The years accumulated gradually. Kestrel's reputation evolved from controversial figure to respected instructor to something approaching institutional legend. New students arrived knowing the Hellman story, having watched the gun camera footage in their training pipelines, treating her with a mixture of reverence and curiosity that she found both gratifying and slightly absurd. She was 34, then 36, accumulating promotions and responsibilities while her students grew younger or she grew older, the mathematics working out the same either way. She thought about Kandahar less frequently, but never completely. The memories had become incorporated into her understanding of herself rather than existing as separate trauma. On certain nights, usually before storms when the air pressure changed. She'd dream about the market square and wake with the familiar weight of irreversible choices. But she'd learned to carry that weight the way athletes carry old injuries, acknowledging its presence without letting it define her capability. The recognition came unexpectedly, as these things do. A formal ceremony at Air Force headquarters, attended by officers from multiple commands and a surprising number of current and former students. General Ashford, now retired but still commanding in civilian clothes, presented Kestrel with a meritorious service medal for her contributions to close air support training and development. The citation was careful in its language, acknowledging excellence without explicitly endorsing the Helmand incident that had defined her public reputation. Havoc-6 was there, older now with gray threading his temples, and he shook her hand with genuine warmth and said simply, "Still alive, all 11 of us, because of you." In her acceptance remarks, Kestrel spoke carefully about the nature of service and sacrifice, the mathematics of trading personal cost for collective benefit, the responsibility that comes with capability. She did not mention Kandahar directly, but alluded to lessons learned through failure as well as success. She thanked her students for trusting her instruction and her commanders for giving her the opportunity to continue serving despite the complications in her record. When she finished, the applause was genuine rather than merely polite, and she recognized in that moment that she'd somehow transformed from controversial figure to respected elder stateswoman of the close air support community. The reception afterward was crowded with people she'd taught, supervised, or worked alongside over the years. Young pilots shared stories of missions where her training had proved critical. Older officers discussed the evolution of tactics and technology, the ways that warfare continued its endless adaptation to new tools and constraints. Kestrel moved through conversations with practiced ease, accepting congratulations while deflecting excessive praise toward the collective effort that military aviation required. She was good at this now, the social performance of leadership, though she still preferred the clarity of cockpits to the ambiguity of conference rooms. Late in the evening, after most attendees had departed, General Ashford found her standing alone near the window, looking out at the darkened flight line where aircraft sat in neat rows waiting for morning. "Thinking about flying?" the general asked without preamble. "Always," Kestrel admitted. "Even when I'm not thinking about it, part of me is calculating wind speed and fuel loads and weapons configurations. It's pathological, probably." Ashford laughed, a genuine sound unmarred by political calculation. "If it is, it's a pathology that served this nation well. I wanted to tell you something I couldn't say officially. When your Helmand incident landed on my desk, I spent 3 days reviewing your file, the gun camera footage, the after-action reports, every scrap of information about who you were and what you'd done. And I kept coming back to one question: would I have made the same choice in her position? And the answer was yes. Absolutely yes. But I never would have had the courage to actually do it, because I'd have been too concerned about career implications and political fallout. You didn't have that hesitation, and it saved lives. That kind of moral courage is rare, and it's worth more than any medal I could give you." Kestrel absorbed this acknowledgement, feeling its weight settle alongside all the other weights she carried. "I'm not sure it was courage," she said slowly. "Might have just been inability to live with watching people die when I had the capability to prevent it. The line between courage and compulsion is pretty thin sometimes." "Maybe," Ashford conceded. "But results matter more than motivation in the end. Those SEALs are alive. Your students are better prepared. The close air support community has better training protocols because of your input. That's a legacy worth having, regardless of whether it started with courage or compulsion or some combination thereof." The conversation drifted to other topics: the future of manned versus unmanned aircraft, the challenges of maintaining expertise in a force increasingly focused on technological rather than human solutions, the eternal question of how to prepare people for violence without destroying their capacity for normalcy afterward. When they finally parted, Kestrel felt simultaneously exhausted and energized, the particular combination that comes from events that require social performance but deliver genuine meaning underneath the pageantry. She flew home the next day on a commercial flight, anonymous among civilians who had no idea that the woman in seat 14B had once stolen a military aircraft to save strangers in a country most of them couldn't locate on a map. Kestrel liked this anonymity, the way it allowed her to exist as regular person rather than symbol or legend. She read a novel about Arctic exploration, watched clouds through the small window, and thought about the strange trajectory that had brought her from fighter pilot washout to decorated instructor. The following months were routine, which meant they were full of the small dramas and satisfactions that constitute normal life. Kestrel taught her classes, mentored struggling students, and maintained her own flying proficiency through regular training flights. She dated occasionally, nothing serious, finding it difficult to connect with people who couldn't understand why she might wake from nightmares about correct target identification. She adopted a rescue dog, a shepherd mix with anxiety issues and a tendency to bark at aircraft noise, which felt appropriately symbolic. On the anniversary of the Helmand mission, she received an unexpected package. Inside was a custom-made challenge coin, featuring the A-10 silhouette on one side and Songbird Helmand 2024 on the reverse, surrounded by 11 small stars representing the lives saved. The note was unsigned, but the handwriting was familiar from after-action reports and commendation requests. Havoc 6, still watching over her story, making sure it was told correctly. Kestrel added the coin to her collection, physical tokens of service that were simultaneously deeply meaningful and slightly embarrassing in their overt symbolism. She thought about legacy sometimes, usually late at night when insomnia made philosophy seem more compelling than sleep. What did she want to be remembered for? The unauthorized mission that saved lives but violated orders. The training that prepared thousands of pilots for the realities of combat. The mistakes in Kandahar that taught hard lessons about the cost of warfare. All of it, probably. The messy totality of a career that had contained both excellence and failure in measures that defied simple summarization. Her final years of active service approached gradually. The Air Force had mandatory retirement ages and regulations, the inevitable mathematics that limited even the most distinguished careers. Kestrel faced this approaching horizon with mixed feelings: relief at the prospect of rest, regret at leaving work that still felt purposeful, curiosity about what life looked like when daily structure and identity weren't provided by military hierarchy. She began the slow process of transition, attending workshops about civilian employment and financial planning, trying to imagine herself in contexts that didn't involve aircraft and violence. The final flight came on a Tuesday morning, clear and cold, the Nevada desert stretching empty in all directions. Kestrel took a training, up one last time, officially for routine proficiency check, but actually for personal farewell. She flew south toward the ranges where she'd spent countless hours teaching students to drop ordnance with precision. The aircraft responded to her inputs with the familiar immediacy that came from hundreds of hours in type. Control stick and throttle extensions of her intention, rather than separate mechanisms requiring conscious operation. She climbed to 15,000 feet and looked down at landscape that was simultaneously beautiful and harsh, carved by wind and time into formations that would exist long after she was gone. The sky above was that particular shade of blue that exists only at altitude, unmarred by horizon haze or atmospheric distortion. Kestrel held the aircraft steady and thought about all the other pilots who'd flown similar aircraft on similar missions, stretching back through decades and conflicts to the earliest days when humans first realized they could kill each other more efficiently from above. The radio crackled with routine traffic, controllers managing the airspace with professional efficiency, pilots checking in and out of training areas with practiced brevity. Kestrel listened to this familiar symphony and felt profound gratitude for having been part of this community, for having contributed, however imperfectly, to the tradition of military aviation. She keyed her mic and made her final radio call as an active duty pilot. Nellie's Tower, Songbird is RTB. Returning to base. Coming home, ending one chapter and moving toward whatever came next. The landing was perfect, or as close to perfect as flying allows. Touchdown precisely on the designated numbers, smooth deceleration, the aircraft settling onto the runway with the satisfied grace of a machine operated by someone who understood its nature completely. Kestrel taxied back to the flight line where a small, informal gathering had assembled. Her squadron, some current and former students, a few officers who'd worked with her over the years. They had champagne, in violation of regulations, but in keeping with tradition, and someone had brought a cake decorated with edible images of the A-10. Lieutenant Colonel Reeves, now full colonel and wing commander, made informal remarks about her career that managed to acknowledge both her conventional achievements and the controversial Helmand mission, without saying anything that would create legal complications.